September 1944. Rain lashes against canvas roofs and steel walls outside a tactical headquarters in northern France. The storm rattles command caravans and turns the ground to mud, but inside one narrow trailer, the weather is irrelevant. A far more dangerous tempest is forming. Two men stand across a map table, locked in a confrontation that threatens to fracture the Allied command at the height of victory. On one side is Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, victor of El Alamein, architect of Britain's redemption in North Africa, and the undisputed commander of the 21st Army Group. He is confident to the point of arrogance, brilliant to the point of intolerance. Montgomery believes in order, hierarchy, and absolute obedience. Armies move when he commands them to move. Generals answer when he summons them. That is how wars are won. On the other side stands General Harry Crerar, commander of the 1st Canadian Army. He is stiff, formal, and outwardly unimposing beside the British legend. But Crerar carries something Montgomery does not fully understand: the authority of a sovereign nation that has already paid too much in blood to be treated as a subordinate colony. Montgomery has reached the end of his patience. To him, Crerar has committed the unforgivable sin, disobedience. Not in battle, but in symbolism. And in Montgomery's world, symbolism matters only when it reinforces command. With a calm, almost courteous tone, the field marshal delivers a sentence that has ended careers across the British Army. Harry, I think our ways must part. In the rigid code of British military language, this is not a suggestion. It is an execution. It means removal, disgrace, a ticket home. Montgomery expects submission. Crerar does not flinch. To understand why a Canadian general would risk his career and the stability of the Allied command over what appears to be a scheduling conflict, one must understand the geography of Canadian grief. To understand the defiance inside that tent, one must travel back to the pebble beaches of Dieppe. The wound called Dieppe. On August 19, 1942, Canadian troops were hurled against the fortified seawalls of Dieppe in Operation Jubilee. It was meant to test Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Instead, it became one of the most devastating military disasters in Canadian history. In a single morning, more than 900 Canadians were killed. Nearly 2,000 were captured. Entire regiments, drawn from tight-knit communities across Ontario, Quebec, and the prairies, were shattered in hours. For 2 years afterward, telegrams arrived in Canadian homes from Toronto to Winnipeg. Sons were gone, brothers missing, fathers dead on beaches with names few had heard before. Dieppe became more than a battle. It became a national wound. By 1944, as the Allies surged across France, the soldiers of the 2nd Canadian Division were not merely advancing toward the coast. They were returning to the scene of a tragedy that had defined them. The Germans had already retreated. There would be no revenge in battle. But there was something else: closure. The liberation of Dieppe was swift. The atmosphere was not triumphant. It was heavy with ghosts. Canadian soldiers walked streets where their friends had fallen. They found graves of men they had trained with, laughed with, buried too soon. A solemn commemoration was planned for Sunday, September 3, 1944. A march past, a memorial service. This was not a parade. It was a national act of remembrance. Crerar's burden. For General Harry Crerar, attendance at Dieppe was not optional. It was not sentimental. It was his duty. Crerar was more than a corps commander inside the British system. He was the highest-ranking Canadian officer in the field. He carried the expectations of Ottawa, of Prime Minister Mackenzie King, and of a public deeply sensitive to the idea that Canadian soldiers were being used as expendable shock troops for British ambitions. The Canadian Army, in Crerar's view, was not a tool of empire. It was an expression of national sovereignty. To stand at Dieppe, to take the salute, to honor the dead of 1942, was a moral and political obligation that transcended tactics. If he failed to appear, if he chose a staff meeting over the graves of Canadian soldiers, he would confirm the darkest fear back home: that Canada was still fighting someone else's war. Crerar made his choice: Montgomery's world. Field Marshal Montgomery lived in a different reality. To him, the war was momentum, logistics, and command efficiency. The past was irrelevant. Only the next objective mattered: Belgium, the Scheldt, the Rhine. An army commander belonged at headquarters, not in cemeteries. Montgomery scheduled a critical conference of his senior commanders for September 3rd, the same day as the Dieppe Memorial. To him, this was no coincidence worth acknowledging. Orders were orders. Crerar received the summons. He checked the calendar. He checked the map. Then he declined. He informed Montgomery's chief of staff that he would attend the Dieppe commemoration and send his own chief of staff in his place. By standard military protocol, this was acceptable. To Montgomery, it was unthinkable. The line is drawn. Montgomery did not see ghosts. He did not hear silence in cemeteries. He saw defiance. To him, Crerar's absence was not about remembrance. It was a challenge to authority, proof that the Canadian general believed himself independent. While Crerar stood among the graves at Dieppe, honoring the fallen of the 2nd Division, another storm was forming back at headquarters. Montgomery's patience was gone. The morning of September 4th, 1944, dawned cold and gray over the Allied headquarters near the Belgian border. Rain from the previous night still clung to the ground, turning the encampment into a sea of mud and canvas. Inside one narrow command caravan, however, the air was dry, tight, and electrically tense. This was the nerve center of the 21st Army Group, the personal domain of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. General Harry Crerar arrived precisely on time. He was immaculately dressed, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable beneath his trimmed mustache. There was no hint of apology in his demeanor, nor defiance. Only discipline, only resolve. Montgomery was already seated behind his desk, surrounded by maps marked with arrows driving eastward toward Germany. This was the future as he saw it: movement, pressure, momentum. He did not rise when Crerar entered. The meeting was not a discussion. It was meant to be an ending. Montgomery began with a cold, controlled voice. He spoke of tempo, of lost opportunities, of Canadian formations moving too slowly through Normandy. He questioned Crerar's battlefield instincts, his caution, his fixation on politics rather than destruction of the enemy. These criticisms were not new. Montgomery had harbored them for months. But every grievance circled back to one moment: Dieppe. Montgomery dismissed the memorial as sentimental indulgence. He framed Crerar's absence from the September 3rd conference as professional negligence. Men were dying, he said. Battles were unfolding. And while that happened, the commander of the 1st Canadian Army had chosen a ceremony over command. To Montgomery, honoring the dead meant winning faster, not standing in graveyards. Crerar listened without interruption. He understood exactly what this was. Montgomery was not seeking explanation. He was building a case. Then the field marshal delivered the sentence he had prepared. "Harry," Montgomery said quietly, "I've had enough. Our ways must part." In British military language, this was final. Polite. Devastating. It meant relief of command. It meant being sent home. It meant failure. Montgomery expected silence, compliance, perhaps a stiff nod. Instead, he got something far more dangerous: two masters. Crerar did not raise his voice. He did not argue tactics or defend his record. He did not speak of Normandy or the Scheldt. He spoke only one sentence. "Go ahead," he said calmly. "I'll consult Ottawa first." The words landed like a detonator. For a moment, Montgomery did not respond. He stared at Crerar, processing what had just happened. The threat he had issued, dismissal, had just been turned inside out. This was not defiance in the British sense. It was something Montgomery was unprepared for. Crerar was reminding him of a reality the Empire preferred to forget. The 1st Canadian Army did not belong to Britain. By law, by agreement, and by political fact, only the Canadian government could dismiss its commander. Montgomery exercised operational control, not sovereign authority. That distinction often blurred in practice, had just been drawn in steel. Crerar answered to two masters. One stood in front of him. The other sat in Ottawa. The Ottawa card. Montgomery immediately understood the implications. If Crerar contacted Prime Minister Mackenzie King, the issue would explode beyond the battlefield. King was fiercely protective of Canadian autonomy and deeply sensitive to any hint of British condescension. He had already fought battles, quiet but intense, to ensure Canada was treated as an equal partner, not a colonial afterthought. A British field marshal firing the commander of the Canadian Army for attending a memorial at Dieppe would be political suicide. The press would seize it. Parliament would erupt. Churchill would be dragged into damage control. At the worst possible moment of the war, Montgomery could remove a British general without consequence. But touching a Canadian commander was an entirely different matter. This was not personnel management. It was diplomacy. And Crerar was not bluffing. He was perfectly willing to escalate the issue, perfectly willing to turn a command dispute into a constitutional crisis if necessary. He knew the weight of Canadian blood on those beaches. He knew Ottawa would stand behind him. For the first time in the conversation, Montgomery was not in control. The blink. Montgomery was arrogant, but he was not foolish. He quickly recalculated. Canada's army held a vital sector of the front. Alienating the Dominion would fracture Allied unity and hand his enemies in London and Washington ammunition they were eager to use. His reputation was already controversial. This would be catastrophic. The field marshal did not apologize. He did not retract his words, but he retreated. The phrase "our ways must part" was quietly set aside, neither withdrawn nor enforced. The conversation shifted awkwardly back to operations, supply routes, troop movements, the coming battles along the Scheldt estuary. The power dynamic in the room had changed permanently. Crerar had drawn a line Montgomery could not cross. Aftermath. The meeting ended without resolution, but with an unspoken understanding. Montgomery would remain supreme commander. Crerar would remain in command of the 1st Canadian Army. But nothing was the same. Montgomery would never forgive the challenge. He would continue to view Crerar as cautious, political, and insufficiently aggressive. Crerar would continue to view Montgomery as brilliant and intolerable. Yet they coexisted. The Ottawa card had been played once. It did not need to be played again. What was really won? The confrontation inside that rain-soaked caravan was never publicized. No headlines appeared. No official record detailed the exchange. But its significance echoed far beyond that muddy field. For the first time in modern warfare, a Dominion Army commander had stood up to Britain's most powerful field marshal, and won. Not with defiance, not with rebellion, but with sovereignty. Canada had entered the First World War automatically, dragged in by imperial obligation. It entered the Second World War by its own declaration, on its own timetable. In that tent in 1944, that independence was tested and proven. The 1st Canadian Army would go on to fight some of the hardest battles of the war. They cleared the Scheldt estuary, opening the vital port of Antwerp. They smashed through the Siegfried Line. They liberated the Netherlands, forging a bond that still endures. Crerar remained in command until the final victory in Europe. The British lion roared. The Canadian maple leaf did not bend. The confrontation ended without signatures, without witnesses, and without a single word reaching the newspapers. No communique was issued. No diary entry captured the tension of that rain-soaked caravan. To the outside world, nothing had happened. But inside the Allied command, everything had changed. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery emerged from the meeting still in command, still the dominant figure of Britain's war effort in Northwest Europe. Yet something subtle had been taken from him, something no battlefield victory could restore. His authority now had a boundary, and that boundary was shaped like a red maple leaf. General Harry Crerar returned to his headquarters without triumph and without celebration. He understood the nature of the victory he had just secured. It was not personal. It was institutional. It was national. And it came with consequences. A cold peace. Montgomery never forgave Crerar for invoking Ottawa. In private conversations, he continued to describe the Canadian commander as overly cautious, politically minded, and lacking the ruthless instinct he believed necessary to crush the enemy. Montgomery admired aggression. Crerar valued responsibility. Their relationship settled into something resembling a cold truce. Orders were followed. Plans were executed. Courtesy was maintained. Trust was not. Montgomery would increasingly bypass Crerar when possible, dealing directly with subordinate Canadian Corps commanders. Crerar, aware of this dynamic, chose not to escalate. He had made his point. Pressing further would risk turning a principle into a feud. The balance was delicate, but it held. The Canadian burden. As autumn turned the Low Countries into fields of mud and water, the 1st Canadian Army was given one of the most difficult and least glamorous tasks of the war: clearing the Scheldt estuary. Antwerp had been captured intact, but its port was useless as long as German forces controlled the river approaches. Without Antwerp, Allied supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Victory depended on opening that port. The task fell to the Canadians. The fighting was brutal. Flat, flooded terrain favored the defenders. German troops fought from dikes, villages, and fortified causeways. Casualties mounted rapidly. Entire units were ground down inch by inch. This was not a battle that would produce headlines or famous photographs. But it was essential. Crerar insisted on careful planning and methodical advances. Montgomery pushed for speed. The old tension resurfaced, but now it was bounded by respect for Canadian authority. Crerar would not be removed. That fact was no longer in question. By November 1944, the Scheldt was cleared. Antwerp opened. The Allied advance was saved. It was one of the most strategically decisive operations of the war, and it belonged to Canada, a nation watching. Back home, Canadians did not know about the confrontation in the command tent, but they saw its effects. They saw their army operating with confidence. They saw Canadian commanders speaking with authority. They saw victories credited to Canadian leadership, not absorbed into imperial narratives. Prime Minister Mackenzie King, ever sensitive to questions of autonomy, quietly approved. Canada was not merely contributing. It was commanding. The ghosts of Dieppe were not forgotten, but they were no longer defining. The Netherlands. In the final months of the war, the 1st Canadian Army pushed north and east, eventually becoming responsible for the liberation of the Netherlands. Here, the meaning of sovereignty took on a human dimension. Canadian troops arrived in starving cities, welcomed not as occupiers or colonial forces, but as liberators. Food was shared. Bonds were formed. Children were named after Canadian soldiers. Flowers appeared where bullets had fallen. The relationship forged in 1945 would last generations. To this day, Dutch soil holds Canadian graves, tended with care. Each spring, tulips bloom in Ottawa, living symbols of gratitude and remembrance. This legacy was not accidental. It was built by commanders who understood that how an army fights matters as much as where it fights. The empire that wasn't there anymore. When the war ended, Montgomery emerged as one of Britain's greatest generals. His reputation was secure. His victories undeniable. But the world he had commanded was changing. The British Empire, already strained by war, would soon begin its irreversible contraction. Dominion nations that had once followed automatically now demanded partnership, equality, voice. Canada had crossed that threshold quietly, decisively, in a muddy field headquarters in 1944. No declaration announced it. No flag was raised. But from that moment on, Canadian commanders would never again be treated as colonial subordinates. Crerar's legacy. Harry Crerar retired without fanfare. He was not flamboyant. He did not seek fame. His name never achieved the mythic status of Montgomery, Patton, or Eisenhower. But his contribution was profound. He proved that national dignity could coexist with coalition warfare. That loyalty did not require submission. That remembrance was not a distraction from victory, but a foundation for it. Crerar understood something many generals did not. Armies fight best when they know who they are fighting for. He did not win with speeches or ultimatums. He won with one sentence. I'll consult Ottawa first. What history often misses. When historians analyze World War II, they focus on maps, tanks, and timelines. But wars are also fought in conversations, quiet ones, behind closed doors, where power shifts without gunfire. The standoff between Montgomery and Crerar was one such moment. It did not change the course of a single battle. It changed the relationship between nations. It marked the moment Canada fully stepped out of the shadow of empire and into the role of equal ally. Not through rebellion, not through bitterness, but through resolve. The final measure. The 1st Canadian Army finished the war flying its own flag, answering to its own government, and earning its place among the victors on its own terms. The ways did not part. They evolved. And they evolved because one man understood that honoring the dead of Dieppe was not about the past. It was about ensuring the future would be different. In that rain-soaked caravan, an empire blinked. A nation stood firm. And history quietly turned a page. The war ended not with a shout, but with silence. In May 1945, as guns finally fell quiet across Europe, the 1st Canadian Army stood victorious on foreign soil, battle-worn, exhausted, and intact. They had crossed France, fought through flooded Dutch lowlands, broken Germany's western defenses, and liberated a starving nation. They did so under their own command, flying their own flag, answering to their own government. No one spoke publicly about the argument in the command caravan in 1944. No memoir lingered on it. No official history highlighted the moment. And yet, its consequences were everywhere. The new reality of alliance. World War II forced nations into coalitions unlike anything history had seen. Victory depended not only on firepower, but on cooperation between states with different cultures, priorities, and political realities. The Montgomery-Crerar confrontation revealed a truth that would shape every future alliance. Military unity cannot erase national sovereignty. From that moment forward, coalition warfare would require something new. Not obedience, but consent. Not imperial command, but negotiated authority. NATO, formed just 4 years later, would be built on exactly this principle. No single commander could dismiss another nation's general. No army would fight without political accountability at home. No alliance could survive if one partner claimed absolute control. That doctrine was not born in a treaty room. It was born in a muddy field headquarters in 1944. Canada after the war. Canada emerged from World War II transformed. It no longer saw itself as a junior partner or a colonial extension of Britain. It had mobilized millions, lost over 45,000 lives, and proven it could command large, independent forces in the most complex war in human history. Canadian officers would now be trained to lead, not merely follow. Canadian governments would demand a voice, not merely consultation. Canadian soldiers would fight knowing their sacrifice was accountable to their own people. The confrontation with Montgomery did not make headlines, but it settled the question permanently. Canada would never again fight someone else's war on someone else's terms. Montgomery's blind spot. Bernard Montgomery remains one of the most studied generals of the war. His victories were real. His organizational skill undeniable. But his worldview belonged to a fading age. He understood armies. He understood discipline. He understood command. What he did not fully understand was that the empire he served no longer functioned as it once had. The world had changed. Nations like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were no longer extensions of British will. They were partners, equal, independent, and politically self-aware. Montgomery learned that lesson not in defeat, but in restraint. For perhaps the first time in his career, he encountered a boundary he could not push through with rank alone. Crerar's quiet example. Harry Crerar never sought recognition for what he did. He never framed himself as a nationalist hero. He never boasted of standing up to Montgomery. That was not his way. His strength was institutional, not theatrical. He understood that true authority does not come from shouting orders, but from knowing exactly where power begins and ends. He knew the law, he knew the politics, and he knew that an army disconnected from its people eventually breaks. Crerar's stand ensured that Canadian soldiers would never again be treated as expendable manpower in someone else's strategy. He didn't raise his voice. He raised a principle, the line that still exists. Every modern coalition, whether military, political, or humanitarian, still lives within the boundary Crerar defined. Commanders may plan battles. Governments decide who fights them. Nations retain the right to say no. That balance is fragile. It always has been, but it is essential. The alternative is empire. The final meaning. When Canadians return to Dieppe today, they do not come seeking victory. They come seeking memory. The stones are quiet. The sea unchanged. The names remain. Those men did not die for schedules or staff meetings. They died believing their country mattered. In 1944, when Harry Crerar chose the cemetery over the conference table, he honored that belief, not just with ceremony, but with action. And when he refused to be dismissed like a colonial officer, he ensured their sacrifice would never again be minimized by hierarchy. The war was fought with tanks and guns, but sovereignty was defended with a sentence. This is where your authority ends, and our country begins. When historians write about World War II, they often measure success in miles advanced, cities liberated, or armies destroyed. But some victories cannot be plotted on a map. They exist in moments, quiet, tense moments, when power is tested and the future is decided without a single shot being fired. The confrontation between Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and General Harry Crerar was one of those moments. It did not change the immediate course of the war. Tanks still rolled east. Infantry still fought and died. Orders still flowed down the chain of command. And yet, something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of the Allied war effort. Canada had drawn a line, and it held. After the storm, in the days following the clash at headquarters, no official statement was made. Montgomery did not report the incident to London. Crerar did not contact Ottawa. Both men understood the unspoken agreement that now governed their relationship. The threat had been made. The counter-threat had landed. Further escalation would benefit no one. Montgomery returned to directing the great Allied machine, but with a new calculation always present. He could pressure Canadian forces. He could criticize them. He could maneuver around them. But he could not remove their commander. Crerar returned to his army, knowing he had survived something far more dangerous than enemy fire, the test of political legitimacy in wartime. From that point forward, the 1st Canadian Army operated with a quiet but unmistakable confidence. It was no longer merely part of the British war effort. It was a national force fighting alongside allies, not beneath them. The long grind east. Autumn 1944 brought no glory. Only mud, water, and exhaustion. The Canadians were tasked with clearing the Scheldt estuary, a sprawling maze of flooded fields, dikes, canals, and fortified villages. It was some of the worst terrain imaginable for offensive operations. The enemy knew it. They dug in. The fighting was relentless. Progress was measured in yards. Casualties mounted. Units rotated in and out of the line, hollowed by weeks of attrition. Montgomery wanted speed. Crerar insisted on method. Their old philosophical divide resurfaced, but now it played out within boundaries. Montgomery could demand results, but he could no longer dictate terms without regard for Canadian judgment or political consequence. The Canadians paid heavily, but they succeeded. By November, the Scheldt was cleared. The port of Antwerp was opened. Allied supply lines stabilized. The final push into Germany became possible. Strategically, it was one of the most important victories of the war. Publicly, it was understated. But within Canada, it mattered deeply. A different kind of leadership. Harry Crerar was never a dramatic commander. He did not seek headlines. He did not cultivate a heroic image. His leadership style was deliberate, controlled, and often misunderstood as hesitation. But Crerar understood something essential. Armies are not just instruments of war, they are reflections of the societies that send them. Canada was a democracy. Its soldiers were citizens. Their sacrifice demanded accountability. Crerar believed that reckless speed without regard for cost was not courage. It was irresponsibility. He believed morale mattered. Memory mattered. National dignity mattered. That belief had taken him to Dieppe. That belief had taken him into Montgomery's tent. And that belief now guided his army through the hardest fighting of the campaign. The Netherlands and the human outcome. In the final months of the war, the 1st Canadian Army was tasked with liberating the Netherlands. The country was starving. German occupation had collapsed the economy. Civilians were desperate, weak, and close to death. Canadian soldiers arrived not just as fighters, but as lifelines. They shared food. They restored order. They protected civilians. What followed was not just liberation, but connection. Families welcomed Canadian troops into their homes. Friendships formed. Children were named after soldiers. Bonds were forged that would last generations. This was the human outcome of an army that understood itself not as an imperial tool, but as a representative of a people. The way Canadians fought and the way they treated civilians was not accidental. It flowed directly from the principle Crerar had defended: accountability to one's own nation and its values. The end of empire thinking. Bernard Montgomery remained a dominant figure until the war's end. His victories stood. His reputation endured. But the world he had commanded was fading. The old imperial assumption that Dominion armies could be directed, replaced, or disciplined as if they were British units was no longer sustainable. Canada had proven otherwise. So had Australia. So had New Zealand. World War II did not just defeat fascism. It accelerated the end of empire. And in that process, moments like the Crerar-Montgomery confrontation mattered more than they appeared at the time. They set precedents. They forced recognition. They quietly rewrote the rules of alliance warfare. After the guns fell silent. When the war ended, Crerar returned to Canada without fanfare. There were no dramatic speeches, no public reckoning with Montgomery, no attempt to shape the narrative. He did not need to. The result spoke for itself. Canada emerged from the war as a confident middle power, militarily capable, politically independent, and diplomatically respected. Its armed forces would never again be treated as colonial manpower pools. Future Canadian commanders would operate within alliances, but always under Canadian authority. That principle, once tested, would never be surrendered. Why the moment endures. The argument in the command caravan did not make history textbooks, but it made history. It showed that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is procedural. Sometimes it is a refusal to accept an assumption everyone else takes for granted. Crerar did not challenge Montgomery with anger. He challenged him with legitimacy. He did not threaten rebellion. He threatened accountability. And that made all the difference. The final accounting. The soldiers buried at Dieppe never saw liberation. They never saw Antwerp open. They never saw the Netherlands freed. But their sacrifice shaped everything that followed. When Crerar chose the cemetery over the conference table, he was not choosing sentiment over strategy. He was choosing meaning. And when he refused to be dismissed like a colonial officer, he ensured that Canadian sacrifice would never again be treated as expendable or secondary. The war was won by many nations. But Canada won something else as well. The unquestioned right to command its own destiny. The last word. In the end, the story is not about Montgomery's pride or Crerar's restraint. It is about the moment a nation quietly said, "We will fight, we will sacrifice, but we will decide." And from that moment on, Canada never stepped back into the shadow.